Dobro večer, prijatelji znanosti, prijatelji Univerze v Novi Gorici, dragi sodelavci. Dobrodošli na naslednjem v seriji znanstvenih večerov tukaj v dvorcu Lantieri. In med nami bi rad pozdravil nocojšnjega gosta, predavatelja, dr. Grišo Močnika, ki spada v kategorijo znanstvenikov, ki jih vabimo na te večere in so uspeli združiti tako uspešno znanstveno kariero, kot tudi podjetniško žilico, če temu tako rečemo. Dear guests, welcome to the next in the series of scientific evenings here in Lantieri Mansion. Our guest tonight is Dr. Grisha Močnik, who studied physics at the University of Ljubljana, where he also earned his doctoral degree, while working mainly at the Jožef Stefan Institute and different institutions, including Wageningen Agricultural University in the Netherlands and universities in France and Germany. And his work focused mainly on the development of methods for characterization of highly absorbing and scattering materials. So this scattering is probably the link between the past work and the work that he does today. And today he is the director and chief scientific officer of the Aerosol company, which produces instruments for measurements of carbon black. In this field, carbon black, measurements of carbon black and studies of aerosols, he gained quite substantial international reputation. Therefore, he became also a member of the United Nations Economic Council for Europe, expert group on black carbon. Grisha Močnik has been a principal investigator, researcher, and scientific advisor in numerous development and research projects in the field of aerosol instrumentation and laser devices. His work is mostly focused on the development on filter-based instrumentation for research of aerosol optical properties and application of this instrumentation, in particular measurement of black carbon and other light-absorbing carbonaceous aerosols. His current research includes source identification of carbonaceous aerosols for local studies and also in contexts of long-range transport, vertical profiles of primary combustion products, and methods for emission measurements. Grisha has also been advisor to several PhD students, and particularly through this work and work with the postdoctoral researchers, he is still keeping contact with academic institutions, including University of Nova Gorica. So, Grisha, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's fun to be sort of back, because when I was working on my PhD, Mladen was my thesis advisor. So, you know, I have to thank Mladen for what I am today, at least in part. What I'm going to talk about is not just black carbon, but also other carbon-containing aerosols, which we call carbonaceous matter. And the interesting thing about black carbon is that it is related to sources, because it's a primary pollutant. This means that that's what's emitted. Other carbonaceous aerosols can be emitted, or they can also be generated in the atmosphere. And as we investigate carbonaceous aerosols, we see that their spatial and temporal variation is substantial. And we can gain a lot of knowledge from this and from other aerosol properties to determine what the sources are. So, the carbonaceous aerosols are important for different things, and they're important for different things on different scales. And I'll start with the global relevancies, and then I'll go down step by step towards very local variation of black carbon concentrations, which are relevant for what we breathe. I'll start with explaining what black carbon is, why it's important, and how we measure it. Then I'll spend a substantial amount of time for the results of a campaign of black carbon measurements during a flight of an ultralight airplane which was built in Aidoshina around the world. And I'll talk a little bit about the sources, especially focusing on wood burning and traffic, which are the two dominant sources of air pollution globally, especially in Central Europe. Black carbon is a primary product of incomplete combustion. That means that when we burn carbonaceous fuels, we produce particles which are emitted from the sources. Black carbon is the black stuff that we see coming out of a tailpipe of a dirty diesel car driving in front of us on a highway. And it's black because it absorbs light very uniformly across the visible spectrum. And this is the property that we use to measure it. It's not automatically related to the amount of fuel which is burned. It's not related to CO2 emissions. And as such, it's very difficult to predict how much of black carbon is emitted during combustion of a certain fuel, because the emission factors vary by orders of magnitude, 5 orders of magnitude. So when we model emissions, this is a problem. And this is the main motivation for measurements. In order to know what's going on, we need to measure black carbon. But black carbon particles from different sources have different properties. And we can use these properties to determine the sources. Because black carbon, in particular, is relevant for two very different topics. One is climate change, and the other is human health. So when black carbon is emitted, it's emitted as these little onion-type particles, about 20 nanometers in diameter, which are layered graphitic layers which are stacked one upon the other to form these onion-shaped particles. And these particles aggregate in fractal chains. As the particles age, first these chains collapse and then they're coated. And as these processes take place in the atmosphere, these collapsed chains are coated with organics and with inorganic salts such as ammonium sulfate. And all of this impacts the optical properties of the aerosols which we can measure. Why do we bother? And this is the reason. This is a picture I took from an airplane when landing in New Delhi. And this haze is not fog. The relative humidity was very low. It was about 40%. These are aerosols. And these aerosols cover very large regions. And in India, the amount of sunlight getting to the ground is reducing. And this is relevant for agriculture, for instance. So, we, of course, it's obvious, we want to know what is causing this. And the cause of this regional haze is burning of biomass. The whole region is covered in haze from small fires. And in this case, it was agricultural residue. So it was stuff that was left after the harvest and burned. And this is relevant in terms of climate. We all know about the effects of CO2. CO2 absorbs infrared radiation. Earth is warm. It radiates in the infrared. CO2 absorbs this radiation and the atmosphere warms. And this warming effect takes place at the ground level and in the atmosphere. And the total contribution of CO2 at the top of the atmosphere is about just above 1.5 watt per square meter. black carbon is much less homogeneous than CO2. So contributions in some places are bigger than in others. And it absorbs sunlight. And because it absorbs sunlight, it warms the atmosphere. And it warms the atmosphere more than CO2. But it cools the surface because less sunlight gets to the surface. So it stabilizes the atmosphere. And the net effect is just under 1 watt per square meter in terms of the direct effect due to heating, because light is absorbed and this heats the planet. Black carbon also has indirect effects. It affects cloud formation. It affects precipitation. If there are a lot of small particles in the atmosphere, as water nucleates around these particles, clouds are formed. But if we have a lot of small particles, these droplets of water never grow enough to form big droplets, which are then fall to the ground as rain. As black carbon is deposited, it can be deposited on snow and ice, and it can alter the albedo, making snow and ice darker, and because then light absorption continues even on the surface, this ice and snow melts, and we have another indirect effect of black carbon. When we add the direct and indirect effect, the contribution of black carbon is above 1 watt per square meter. If we look at the increase of temperature relative to the beginning of the 20th century versus time, we see that the measurements show an increase of temperature, and then we have a couple of models, and we have a reference scenario which is business as usual, and we see that by 2050 we will reach the 2-degree limit. If we take aggressive measures in reducing CO2 and other climate forcers, we may avoid this heating. But if we remove black carbon from the atmosphere, we gain some time. We still reach the 2 degrees, but we reach them later. So the difference between CO2 and black carbon is that black carbon has a much shorter lifetime in the atmosphere. And because it lives less time in the atmosphere, if we take measures to reduce the emissions, we get an instantaneous result. And this result is a delay of heating by about 20 years. Then, after 20 years, the increase of temperature continues with the same rate if we don't do anything about CO2. So the key to mitigating climate change is limiting CO2 emissions. Unfortunately, this is not politically very easy. By limiting black carbon emissions, we can gain time to do something about CO2. And because black carbon is such a politically advantageous parameter, I have great hopes about mitigating climate change. At the same time, with the same measures which we can take to delay the heating, we gain also in terms of human health. The same measures will reduce the mortality due to air pollution. In India, more than 800,000 people annually die because of air pollution. In China, almost 700. These are the reductions for the same measures which we take for climate. So it's a win-win situation. And this is what makes mitigating black carbon emissions a no-brainer. Even if we reduce the emissions less than we want to, we still gain in terms of health, even if we don't achieve our climate objectives. So why do we want to improve human health? Because the mortality ratio for certain diseases is substantially larger than 1 due to particulate air pollution. For instance, for lung cancer and cardiopulmonary disease, it's about 1.4. So the probability that you die of such a disease is 40% larger if you live in a place which is polluted, which when you breathe in the particles, you breathe them deep into your lungs, they go into your blood system and they cause inflammation. And this obviously is not good for us. When we compare black carbon to other parameters which are measured, such as PM10, which are all particles smaller than 10 micrometers, that's a regulated parameter, we see that black carbon has a stronger statistical association with the unwanted effects of air pollution with particles. That's why World Health Organization report says that when we look at the effects of air pollution by particles on health, it's a good idea to measure not only what is regulated, but also black carbon, because it is more, the association between health effects of air pollution and black carbon are stronger, so it gives you it has a stronger predictive power than the regulated parameters. So, all that being said, there is a substantial scarcity of measurements. Because black carbon is not regulated, people don't measure it unless they're interested in it. We need to measure not just on the surface, but in the whole atmospheric column, and we need to measure with different wavelengths, and we need to measure with a high time resolution. And I'll come back to the advantages of such a measurement, giving examples. Black carbon is black, and this is its most prominent feature. So we use optical methods to measure it. And the advantage of optical methods is that it has a very high time resolution. Compared to the chemical analysis of particulate matter collected on filters, for example, which have a time resolution of 1 day, we can measure with 1 minute, sometimes even 1 second time resolution. It is very sensitive because black carbon is very black. We can use this sample for other types of analysis, for chemical analysis. We can make small instruments and we can use different wavelengths of light to probe the sample, which gives us even more information. So the instrument that we make in aerosol is called the ethalometer, and it works by collecting the sample on a filter and then shining light through it. And then we detect light passing through the part of the sample, the filter tape with the sample, and the part which is clean. And then we compare these two and we calculate the attenuation of light. And from the difference between two consecutive measurements, we calculate the absorption of light due to the particles collected on the filter. And we do this with different wavelengths of light. Then we convert absorption into mass by dividing the absorption coefficient with the specific mass absorption cross-section, because black carbon absorbs about 2 orders of magnitude more than anything else that's aerosolized. And we do this every minute. These are the two instruments. This is the instrument which has been made for a very long time. This is the new instrument which we commercialized 2 years ago. And they both work using the same principle. And this is the filter with the sample spots. So each of these spots is several hours of data. Now, we always want to do something different. And when Mateusz Lenarčič decided to fly around the world, we said we want to put an instrument into your airplane. That's great, but such an instrument weighs 20 kilos. And this is a very small airplane. So we had to build a small special prototype and this meant, tinkering with the plane, tinkering with the instruments. We installed something that Mateusz was able to put into the cockpit and not really operate except switch on and switch off. And we installed an inlet for the aerosols on the wing just above the pitot tube. So the aerosols were sampled in here, then traveled through the wing into the cockpit where the instrument was located. And we measured concentrations of black carbon. We measured sources which were very well defined, such as we call them point sources. This is a power station burning oil. In other places, the sources can be distributed, which means we have a lot of small sources, each of which doesn't contribute much, but because of the sheer number of these small sources, the contribution to air pollution is huge. This is in Mexico, this is in Nepal. The air pollution in the plume of the power station and the air pollution above this urban area is about the same, but the sources are completely different. When these air masses rise in the atmosphere, sometimes they get trapped in very well-defined layers. And we see these sooty layers, polluted layers, which are then transported over long distances. A lifetime of such a layer can be measured in weeks. And this is a picture from Southeast Asia, this is a picture from Africa. These layers are about the same thickness, and they're about 3 kilometers high. And this is the height which is highly relevant for cloud formation. We've seen areas with increased concentrations. And the reasons for these concentrations can be different. And we see this from looking at the temporal patterns. We see events, we see plumes. This is, for instance, a plume from a large city. We can see concentrations which are very constant, but still quite high for 3 kilometers above above ground. We see sometimes plumes of which we couldn't identify the source. And here the concentrations over Congo vary a lot. But the most interesting region was Southeast Asia and India. And the reason for that is that in the tropics, the layer of air which is well mixed is very thick. So flying at 3 kilometers, we fly just on the top of this well mixed layer where the sources on the ground contribute up to 3 kilometers. And we saw some very high concentrations. The first region of interest was over Burma, where we have encountered a plume which the models predict that it was probably advected from the surface vertically straight up. And when we saw this plume with the maximum concentrations which are quite spectacularly high, this is concentration that you can measure in Ljubljana in summer, for instance. We wanted to know what is the source of this plume. And to do this, we look at the dependence of absorption of aerosols on the wavelength. And we can parameterize this absorption with an exponent. The absorption is proportional to 1 over the wavelength of light to an exponent. And this exponent for black diesel is 1, and the dependence of absorption on the wavelength is very tame. It's not anything spectacular. If we look at this Ångström exponent for biomass combustion products, we see that it's much larger because the absorption in blue and ultraviolet is much higher. And that's because of the emission of large quantities of organic compounds which absorb at this low wavelength. And these two exponents are specific for the source, which means that they enable us to say something about the sources. So we calculated the angstrom exponent of absorption, and we see that during this plume, we see a specific increase of the angstrom exponent from 1.2 to 1.6. And this tells us that this plume is associated with biomass burning, which means that biomass burning is relevant in terms of the climate, because this source can be transported from the surface into the free troposphere. The flight continued to Nepal and then over India, and in India we saw this very homogeneous cloud of high concentrations. Oops. So we wanted to know where air during this flight came from. And we see here a model back trajectory, so it's a model calculation where the air measured at this point came from. And we see that the air parcel originated at about 1 kilometer, then it went a little bit down, up, and then it reached ground level just about here. This is Gujarat, part of India. And then the air was transported southeast, and we measured this at 3.5 kilometers. Just before landing, the back trajectory shows that the air travels from the same place, but close to the ground over the Arabian Sea, close to the surface, close to the coast, where there are no sources. So we see that these two measurement points have the same potential origin. And when we look at the absorption now, we see that the absorption changes in UV a lot, also in infrared, but we also see a very homogeneous distribution of the angstrom exponent. It's between 1.2 and 1.3, which means we have a huge, huge brown cloud of biomass smoke over the whole subcontinent. And you can see this literally because these particles were impacted onto the airplane, and the airplane was dirty. Now, what is the relevance of this very high value of the angstrom exponent? Most climate models assume that aerosols are black. They assume the angstrom exponent of 1. Now, depending on the model, there is a bias due to the fact that regionally these values can be much higher. So over India, for this particular case, this exponent was 1.3. And depending on the model, the absorption of solar light, and this is the spectrum, can be between 7 and 24% underestimated in these models. So some of the models underestimate absorption due to the aerosols in the atmosphere by 1/4. That is substantial. 7% is irrelevant because the models have a large uncertainty. But if we have an underestimation by 1/4, we're underestimating the rate of increase of temperature. So to sum up this part of my talk, we've generated a huge data set that we are still processing. We've identified hotspots. We've seen long-range transport. We've seen values both in concentration and in composition, which are different and higher than what the models assume. We've measured it at an altitude range, which is not important just for climate forcing, but also for cloud formation. And we've seen that we can tell something about the sources from our measurement. Now, when we go down from these high altitude measurements to ground level, we need to use a different platform. And these are measurements in Milano, which were performed with the balloon. Now, with the aircraft, we've measured above this height. And we see here with the balloon measurements show us a very homogeneous mixing layer, and then this is the top of the mixing layer, and above it the concentrations are much lower. What we breathe on the ground is much higher than what is mixed into the atmosphere, because we are very close to the sources and because the Po Valley, where Milano lies, is one of the most polluted places in Europe. Now, when we go to the ground level, we want to know what we breathe and we want to know what is emitted. And this is an example from 2009. The measurement was taken in January, February, and March of 2009 at a station which is in the park across the street from this mall, Culandia. So it's a site which is impacted by traffic a lot. And here we see the change of black carbon concentrations during the day, from midnight to noon to midnight. And we see the difference between a typical workday and a Sunday. And we immediately see this peak on workdays that's not there on Sundays, and we know that this is traffic. But we don't know what causes this afternoon peak, because the increase from the background is the same, and they look identical, they happen at identical times. So we need to extract more information out of our data to be able to determine what are the sources. And when we look at the composition, which is the amount of black carbon in PM10, we see that this changes for a factor of 3 during the day, from 5% at night to 15% during a workday. That means that the composition changes. It also means that the different sources contribute differently. And the other big source, the source other than traffic, is biomass burning. So burning, in Slovenia, this means burning of wood for domestic heating. And wood has been burned for heating our houses or homes for a very long time, and it's not going away anytime soon. The problem with burning wood is that it can lead to very high emissions of carbonaceous aerosols. And this is an example from Gosmartulk, where we see huge emissions from one source. But we also see haze, which is transported up and down the valley slowly. So a small number of sources can impact air quality over large regions, especially in winter, where we have a constrained topography and an inversion, so the air is not mixed very well. The polluted air travels up and down alpine valleys. It is trapped in basins. We use the same methodology of looking at the dependence of absorption on the wavelength, and we can separate diesel exhaust and biomass smoke or wood burning, and we decouple this into two contributions. So here we see in blue total black carbon concentrations during the day. In red we see the traffic contribution, and in green we see the wood burning contribution. And we see that the majority of black carbon is due to traffic. In Zagorje, which is a small town in central Slovenia, it's about 3/4. Wood combustion contributes about 1/4. Now, this tells us which sources contribute to primary air pollution. But we also see that the time evolution of these two sources is completely different. This becomes important when you want to regulate the sources. Of course, we use a proxy. We use light absorption and its dependence on the wavelength to determine the sources. So we want to validate our measurements. And we validate with levoglucosan. And the levoglucosan is this strange sugar which is generated when you burn cellulose. And it has a single source, burning cellulose. So it's a good marker. We use ion chromatography to determine levoglucosan, and this was performed by the Environmental Agency of Slovenia. We compare levoglucosan to black carbon from wood burning, we plot these regression curves, and we get these very nice linear plots, which we are happy with, because this means that both of these are from the same source, and because this is linear, and because these are two primary pollutants, this validates our model. And now we'll make a very short commercial for our new instrument. This instrument already implements this model. So when you make the measurement, you get an online reading, not just of the concentration, but also of the contribution of biomass burning to black carbon concentrations. And black carbon is just one part of the coin. The other is carbonaceous matter. So black carbon is a primary pollutant. That's what's emitted from a tailpipe or a chimney. It tells us how the sources behave, and it is related very well to health effects because it's related to sources. Carbonaceous matter, on the other side, is all carbon-containing particles in the air, which means this is what we breathe, this is what contributes to the mass of all particles in the air. Carbonaceous matter is not only the black carbon and organic carbon which are emitted from the sources. A large part of carbonaceous matter is also particles which are formed in the atmosphere from the substances which are emitted from the sources as gases. And these gases then get oxidized in the atmosphere. The partial pressure changes, they condense into particles. That makes source apportionment very complicated. And we see that we can determine the diurnal profiles not only of black carbon, but also of carbonaceous matter. And when we look at black carbon, the majority of black carbon comes from traffic, the majority of carbonaceous matter comes from wood burning, because we emit such huge amounts of organic matter when we burn biomass. And we want to know what are the sources of this biomass, of this carbonaceous matter in the atmosphere. And we measured this in Maribor. We measured the background site and the city center site. And we wanted to know what is the distribution of carbonaceous matter concentrations in Maribor. Maribor lies in a basin with hills to the north and to the east, and low mountains to the west and southwest. So this is quite closed, and there are a lot of exceedances of PM10. So when we look at the concentrations of carbonaceous matter during the day, we see that at the background level, traffic contributes only 15% and doesn't change much during the day. Wood smoke has this reduction of concentrations during the day and a maximum in the evening, and it contributes 85%. In the city center, the contribution of biomass burning is about 2/3, and the traffic has a very small contribution during the night, which goes up during the morning rush hour, and then it's constant during the day. Now, this was calculated from the measurement and some assumptions, so we want to, when we compare the city center and the background, we take a ratio of the city to the background because we eliminate some of the assumptions, and we see that the traffic increases during the day about 3.5 times, but wood smoke doesn't. Wood smoke is very constant during the day. Wood smoke inside the city behaves the same way as outside the city. And the concentrations of wood smoke in the city are about 80%, 75% of those outside the city, which means that wood smoke is regional. So when we take abatement measures for traffic, we locally improve air quality. If we want to address the major polluter, 2/3 in the city center due to wood smoke, we need to take measures which are not limited to the city. They need to be regional. And this is politically much more complicated. In addition to the particles which are harmful for health, we also have some pollutants which are cancerogenic and are proven to be cancerogenic. And one of these are polyaromatic hydrocarbons. This is benzoapyrene. Benzoapyrene is regulated. And when we look at the relationship between benzoapyrene and black carbon from wood burning, we get also a linear relationship, which means that benzoapyrene is emitted during wood burning. Which means if you burn wood in an inefficient way, you create cancerogenic compounds which we then all breathe. And the message here is not to ban wood burning. The message is to burn wood in the right way. Unfortunately, it's much easier to limit traffic than wood burning. And I'll show an example from Milano. Milano is a huge city in the Po Valley, one of the most polluted regions in Europe. 90,000 vehicles drive into the city center every day. So they wanted to improve air quality because they calculated that they can achieve a 20% reduction in the mass of particles with traffic restrictions. They did that, they measured absolutely no difference in a station inside this restriction zone and the station outside. And this became a huge political issue. What we did was we measured the PM10, PM2.5 and PM1, so particles smaller than 10, 2.5 and 1 micron, and black carbon in 3 different radial directions, going from the non-regulated zone into the regulated zone into the pedestrian zone. And what we have shown is that there is no reduction in PM at all. In fact, particles increased when we went from the non-regulated zone to the regulated zone to the pedestrian area. Now, this increase is not statistically relevant, but we see no difference. When you look at the content of black carbon in PM, we see a 2.5-fold reduction between the non-regulated zone and the regulated zone, and a 3-fold reduction between the non-regulated zone and the pedestrian zone. So there is a huge, huge difference. And because black carbon is more closely associated with health effects than PM, the measures which were taken in Milano do improve air quality. They reduce the effects of particles in the air on health. So it's a matter of measuring the right parameter. And I'll skip over an example in Ljubljana, and I'll just summarize. Using the ethalometer, we can, in a very simple way, determine the sources of air pollution, both of the primary air pollution, black carbon, which tells us how the sources of air pollution behave, and of the carbonaceous matter, which tells us how these sources contribute to the mass of all particles in the atmosphere. We can do this with very high time resolution, and we can measure the spatial distribution of these pollutants. We can measure the correlation between different pollutants, and doing this, we have determined the sources of polyaromatic hydrocarbons. We've developed a new instrument which is better and provides a more accurate measurement. And all of these improvements can be employed in monitoring of abatement measures. So we can not just determine which sources need to be addressed to reduce air pollution, but we can also monitoring the effectiveness of these measures. And at the moment we are involved in a very big study in France, where they will exchange they want to exchange 7,000 wood stoves in a valley, going from Chamonix downstream. And we hope to be able to measure the reduction of air pollution due to the change of these wood stoves with new ones. So with this, I'll stop. I've talked long enough. Now it's time for you to ask questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Grisha, for this excellent overview of the problems in, let's say, aerosol science and the instrumentation that helps to give us answer on these issues. Before questions from the audience, let's relax a little bit and chat about your small company, let's say. What does it make a young scientist with, at least as we see it, less complicated career ahead of him, deciding for a private business in,
I wouldn't say
as you did?
I wouldn't say it's less complicated. What we do, we are a small company. We've grown to 14 people, and more than 1/3 of the company are physicists and environmental engineers with PhDs. So we make instruments they're used in science and monitoring. We make scientific instruments, and development of scientific instruments is a very complex endeavor. On one hand, you need to make instruments which are robust, simple to use, and can be installed in some very challenging places. On the other hand, you want an instrument that is sophisticated enough to enable sophisticated science. Our instruments are not only used for monitoring purposes in terms of air quality, they're also used in scientific experiments where in laboratory conditions people attempt to model what's going on in the atmosphere. And when you develop such an instrument, you need to address all of these potential uses at the same time. So you need the interdisciplinary group of physicists, chemists, electrical engineers, mechanical engineers, who design an instrument, make a prototype, then make measurements, redesign the instrument, make more measurements with the redesigned instrument, and then make a commercial prototype, which you then give to an outside user that you need to understand. You need to know, or you need to learn how they want to use it. And all of this process takes much less time than you would want to have. There's always a lot of pressure. So you need to not only design instruments, you need to know how these instruments are made, and the feedback from the users is crucial for this. But the best feedback is that when you are the user yourself. When you putting yourself into the shoes of the users is the best feedback that you can get. So in terms of what we do is we make instruments, we use them for measurements, and then we go back and we make better instruments. And by doing this, I think we can make very good instruments for measurements of black carbon, but we also do very interesting things. We learn something new every day. And as far as I'm concerned, that's the best job one can have.
Thank you. I didn't mention this when I was introducing you to our audience tonight, but in your CV I could see quite an impressive list of scientific publications, which let's call us regular scientists or just scientists usually link with the problems of patents in the companies like you're working in. So do you see this conflict? How do you resolve it in your case?
We are lucky. We make scientific instruments. The best marketing that we can have are scientific publications. And with my scientific background, making the information that we collect during the development and measurements with our prototypes public is very satisfying. But it's also a marketing tool. And when you make this information public, of course, you are revealing things about the instrument that you make. We work in a very narrow niche, and our users expect all of the information to be public. So it's a matter of timing. When we developed this new instrument, we implemented about 3 patentable solutions. And we made sure that we applied for patents before publishing the results which would reveal how things are designed and how they're implemented technically in the instrument. So it's a matter of timing. You design your instrument, you make the first tests in the laboratory, you write the patent, you submit the patent, then you put this prototype into the field, sometimes also in the hands of your collaborators from universities, from institutes. Then you work on the data and publish it. And by the time that this is published, the patent is submitted, and sometimes also in a phase where you're already protected. The really important part is that you protect the knowledge, the intellectual property, before you submit a paper. And it sounds more complicated than it is. It's essentially a matter of compiling a schedule that you can stick to.
Okay, so it's doable.
Yes, you have to do it. I mean, for instance, our older instruments are being copied, and we have a very strong brand. Our instruments hold about 80% of the global market. But sooner or later, we are going to face competition that is going to dump the prices. And we do not want to engage in a price war. In a price war, it's a race to the bottom. Everybody loses. What we want to do is to provide additional features, to provide additional information, added value to the customer that the customer wants, and they're prepared to pay for it. So in terms of being a commercial company, we need to make sure we have something new all the time. We have a new instrument now, out for about 2 years. Now we are working aggressively on accessories, which can be used together with our instruments, so that we essentially enlarge the possible applications of the instrument. In addition to this, we have started working on software and hardware, which enables the use of our instruments in networks, in large monitoring networks, in networks which span countries or subcontinents. And I'm very glad that, for instance, we just got, a month ago, we won a tender in India where we will install the national black carbon network in the whole country, going from the Himalayas all the way to the south, into the Arabian Sea, into the Bay of Bengal. So it's going to be a very exciting January and February.
Okay, let's give some chance to our audience to ask questions. I'm sure with your interesting lecture you raised a lot of curiosity.
I don't have a question, I just have one comment. In the map you show Arabian Sea, but this is not Arabian Sea, this is Persian Gulf.
When I say Arabian Sea, that's the sea between Africa, the Middle East and India.
Yeah, but I understand. But we have a big fight with Arabian country. I'm originally from Iran, so I'm sorry, I'm very sensitive about this.
I understand.
Okay.
Thank you.
Another question? Professor Zsiksz?
I have a number of questions regarding this black carbon layer. The first one is probably stupid for all of you who know something on that field. I don't know anything. Why the layer is formed? This is one question. Then, what is the dynamics? How does it move? Only by wind or diffuses around? Does it get broader?
Atmosphere is a layered structure, and as long as the temperature layers are well defined and not mixed, anything that we inject broadens slowly due to diffusion. The time scale really depends on the meteorology. If nothing is left alone, these layers can be very long-lived. Fortunately, the mixing in the atmosphere makes sure that this is not just, that this just does diffuse, but is also mixed with very strong vertical mixing. For instance, in Ljubljana, in winter, in a basin, the mixing layer is about, in the morning, is thinner than 100 meters. So everything that is emitted from the ground stays in these 100 meters. And that's why when you go to work in Ljubljana in the morning, the air is thick. During the day, this layer increases, and this sucks in air and it mixes it very well. Over India, this layer in March, February, March, when this flight was taking place, is 3-4 kilometers thick. So this layer is well mixed. The layers which we saw are above this layer. And the experiments which were performed by the Indian Space Agency with balloons show very well defined layers, the same as we've seen, essentially, which were most probably transported from the foothills of the Himalayas all the way into central India. So hundreds of kilometers. And the time scale for this is probably days, if not a week. And the concentrations in such a layer can be very high. They can be what we see next to a road in Nova Gorica or Ljubljana. And these are well-defined events where, for instance, an inversion layer over a city breaks and is vertically advected into a well-defined layer where there's another inversion, but much, much higher. The other possibility is agricultural fires. Agricultural fires happen after the harvest, and they're seasonal, so after the rice harvest, after the wheat harvest. And these are events which are not specific for any place in the earth. We can see them in Asia, in Europe, in South America. Over the Amazon, for instance, we also get a lot of burning of the forest, which is also transported regionally. The advantage in the Amazon is that the atmosphere is very humid, so there is a lot of wet deposition. And this is a very fast process compared to diffusion or advection. And wet removal by growing droplets of water around these particles and then with precipitation, this is the most efficient way to remove particles from the atmosphere. And we know this because, after a shower, we can see the mountains from Vipava.
Yes, Albert.
You need to have enough oxygen. And this sounds easy to achieve. You have to take care of the draft through your wood stove. The problem with efficient burning of wood in small wood stoves is that the amount of wood that you can burn efficiently is not very much. So if you want to put wood into your wood stove in the evening and not get up at 2 a.m. to reload the stove, you need to put in more fuel that is efficient, so that the wood stove is warm throughout the night. And we've performed an experiment where we had a wood stove which is burned according to the instructions, and one which is burned by putting as much wood as we could into a stove. And then we burn this, we measure emissions, but we also put these emissions into a chamber, and we age it artificially with UV lights and ozone, essentially. And then we look at what is formed. And we see that by burning wood inefficiently, we create a lot of polyaromatic hydrocarbons, so carcinogenic compounds which are very bad for us. When these are aged, they form oxidized PAHs in relatively small, not in large quantities, because these pathways of oxidations are different, but some of these oxidation products are very toxic. So burning wood in an inefficient way is not good for you. And the solution to this is not to not burn wood, not to ban wood burning, but to provide a way how wood can be burned efficiently. And there are two ways how to do this. One is to provide subsidies to households to buy new wood stoves. But the problem is, what happens after 10, 15 years? Will these wood stoves be maintained? And I'm not very optimistic about this way of increasing the efficiency of wood combustion. I'm much more in favor in building district heating systems on biomass. For instance, in Austria, this is very popular. Unfortunately, these are big infrastructural projects that are quite expensive. And, this is feasible in Austria. It might not be feasible in Slovenia. And there needs to be a lot of investment, a lot of subsidies of either the national government or local governments to achieve something like this because of the required infrastructural investment. But let's not forget, the biggest success story in air quality was exactly the transition from individual heating units to district heating in Ljubljana. In the 1980s, the transition to district heating eliminated coal. And eliminating coal improved air quality in Ljubljana. I remember when I was a kid, when you would get in winter, you would get into a warm place and you would smell this acidic, characteristic smell of coal. And this is gone. And the air pollution due to combustion of coal is no more. There's no more sulfur emitted in the atmosphere. There is no more particles. And, Ljubljana is a nicer place to live because of that. Even though still it's one of the dirtier cities in Europe. The statistical reduction of life in Ljubljana is about 1 year due to particulate air pollution, which is not great.
I'm sure there are still a lot of questions, but I also have the duty to invite you to join us for informal discussion downstairs, taste some university wine and have some food. Therefore, I kindly ask you to save your questions and join our speaker later on. So you're all invited to stay in this beautiful environment. And At the end, I ask you to thank our speaker again for his excellent presentation tonight.